Today is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. It's a day to honor and understand the experiences Indigenous peoples in Canada have faced and continue to face. It's a day to listen to survivors of the residential school system and honor those who never came home. It's a day of learning and acknowledgement. And that's what we're committed to doing here on Cityline today. There are stories of harsh realities, past and present sorrows, but also stories of resilience and joy and incredible talent. But we're starting with truth and reconciliation. We hear those words a lot, but what do they actually mean and how do we put them into practice? Riley Yesno, an Anishinaabe political scholar and advocate from Abmatung First Nation, is here to share her thoughts on Indigenous-Canadian reconciliation and how far we still have to go. Come on in here. I'm so excited to speak with you. We started having a conversation before the show even began, and I thought, I want Riley here every day. Riley, why do you think it took something as disturbing as thousands of unmarked graves of children for Canada to finally listen up and say reconciliation needs to be a priority?
Yeah, I think the graves did that because it shocked people out of their comfortability. And I think that a big problem that we have in Canada is the way that we talk about reconciliation, but only insofar as it's still comfortable for us, as it doesn't cost us too much money, it doesn't disrupt our day-to-day, we don't have to give up land, power, authority, anything that, really transforms people's lives. We're not as willing to engage with as we are about feel-good things like statues or celebrations. And so, though, when you have something as horrific as we found last summer, people, at least for a moment, can no longer deny how real the conversation is and how real it needs to be. And now it's just a question of whether or not Canadians will keep with that.
Okay, so we can put on the orange shirts, but we don't necessarily want to do the work. And there's real work to be done. There's real work to be done. So reflecting on this day and its significance, you say that reconciliation is actually not even necessarily a goal of all Indigenous people. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so when I say that, I'm referencing more of a movement, actually, that started in about 2020 when there was the Coastal Gas Pipeline dispute in BC. And I think for a lot of Indigenous people, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And what I mean by that is, Canada for years at that point had been talking about reconciliation, about 5 years, saying they're super committed to it, all of these things. And then at the same time as they were saying that, they went on Indigenous territory and pointed guns at elders and took them away and arrested them. And so for a lot of Indigenous people, it was a real moment, I think, of being fed up with the way that Canada talks about reconciliation, but actually isn't committed to it. And so instead of saying, we're going to work really hard, we should make you accept reconciliation, they said, maybe it's time for us to also think about other ways. And so to be clear, Indigenous people, I think, who are really critical of reconciliation, it's not that they don't want better futures, that they don't want healing, that they don't want liberation. It's just that they think that the way that we're doing it isn't necessarily the most effective, and sometimes it can even be harmful. And I think thinking critically about those things is actually a really important thing for us to do on this day, especially.
When we talk about different ways that Indigenous folks want to see the path forward, are we seeing a bit of a generational divide?
Yeah, I really think so. In my experience, Indigenous youth are far more critical about reconciliation than older generations. And when I think about why that might be, I think about, my grandparents who are both residential school survivors, and how for them to hear an apology, to get any sort of acknowledgement for their life experience was always a pipe dream. And so they fought really hard to have things like the TRC. They fought really hard for reconciliation as we know it today. But because of their fights, Indigenous youth now have a different fight, right? I grew up with apologies. I grew up with land acknowledgements and all these things, and a lot of Indigenous youth did. And so now recognition isn't enough, and nor should it be, right? Is that I think that's our obligation, is to build on our grandparents' legacies and push forward until we reach that point that they dreamed of, where, we are freer people, where we are healed people, where we are better people. And so I see this push beyond reconciliation as a natural part of that project.
Okay, and I like that because you're not looking back and saying this is divisive. You're saying this is the thread. This is the trajectory. So this is what the elders want. We got it. And now what's next? So let's talk about what's next in terms of what are the other things that might be offered? Is it reparations? What does it look like? What are folks asking for?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there are a huge long list of things, but one thing that I'm really interested in and that I study throughout my PhD is the land back movement. And so land back is one of those things that I think when people hear it automatically, like their like scared senses go up. I think that Canadians especially have this sense that if Indigenous people were to get the land back, which is what land back is about, returning land, power, authority to the hands of Indigenous people who it was stolen from, that they have a fear that if it was to be realized, basically Indigenous people would do to them what they did to us and violently displace them and take them out of their homes and do all these things. And that was never the goal that Indigenous people had. That was never the teachings I know about what we wanted our relationship to be. We want to live in good relationships with each other and with this place. And so land back is more of a push to say, we'll show you. Like once we have the land, you'll see too. And I think it's important that Canadians put away that fear or recognize that fear as something that isn't necessarily a real threat.
Okay, I love the activism that we're seeing coming up grassroots. I love the younger generation rethinking the way we're moving forward and basically saying, you know, an I'm sorry is not enough. Not even enough I'm sorries have been said, but even that it's not enough even when it is said. There are other ways that we could be dealing with this and actually flipping the system and changing the order of things. So in 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission laid out 94 calls to action, further reconciliation between Canadians and Indigenous peoples. 7 years later, like a handful. Like just so few of those calls have actually been respected and carried out. So what stands out to you when you think about it as progress versus performance?
Yeah, I think that the TRC and those calls to action are the perfect way to think about it because it makes it so stark, right? Like we have, I think 11 is where we're at in terms of the calls to action. They're all the really symbolic, fluffy ones. So the things like the national holiday, like a monument to survivors. And then we also have things like, we have some around burials now, but that took, you know, that mass grave uncovering to get us to that point. We had been calling for that since 2013, but it took devastation of that level to force the government their hand. And so that's, to me, encapsulates really how there's a lack of urgency, there's a lack of will. Well, it's one of those things that really feels, for the lives of Indigenous people, like the government's like, we'll get around to it when we get around to it. And Indigenous people are adamant that that's not enough. We're people living in, you know, dire conditions. I come from a community that has the second longest boil water advisory in this country. And so holidays don't do it for me. Sorries don't do it for me. What does it for me is the hard, concrete action that makes the lives better of Indigenous people on the day-to-day. And that's the stuff that Canada and Canadians don't seem to be understanding that they need to be engaging with that first and most.
That's the hard stuff, and that's the real stuff.
Yeah.
When we talk about reconciliation, we have to talk about the fact that, as you mentioned, there are many First Nations that do not have potable water. There's no clean water in Canada in many nations. Like, I'm just saying it again because it sounds ludicrous in 2022. So talk to us about how this affects communities and why it has yet to be solved. Is it because, well, you tell me, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to that point of will. So is that, you know, the government, when they say we can't do this, they'll give you a list of things like, oh, it's hard to access up there. A lot of these communities without water are fly-in communities, so it costs a lot of money to transport materials. Then you got to train people to do it. They'll basically give you a list of things that are excuses about why they haven't got it done to this point. And I can recognize the difficulty and the complexity of all of those things. But at the end of the day, I think if you have enough will and you have enough commitment, you make it happen. And I think actually COVID is a really interesting time where we saw the government flip a 180 in like 2 seconds when the country needed it, and they suddenly had millions of dollars to spend on COVID relief. They suddenly had action that they could do out the wazoo. But when it comes to Indigenous people, that same urgency and that same action, despite how atrocious the living conditions people are living in, doesn't translate the same. And so it's definitely, I think, a shame, but a shame because of the lack of will, because of the lack of commitment.
Okay. Things can get done. We've seen hard things done, right? But it's not being done in these issues that we're talking about right now. So reconciliation is not just a government issue. This is an issue for all of us, everyone that's on this land. What should we consider when it comes to personal acts of reconciliation? Let's talk a little bit about what we need to do as our individual selves in our homes on stolen land.
Yeah. So, I mean, when we were talking about this earlier, we talked about truth, and I think that is what we should be really thinking about today. And the truth of the matter is that that Indigenous people in Canada are not free people, that we are people that live with the ongoing colonialism that shapes this place, and that for non-Indigenous people, despite maybe not being the ones that started the process of colonization, people still benefit from it. You can only live on these lands because Indigenous people are displaced from them and don't have access to them. And so that's a hard pill to swallow, to think that, you know, you are complicit, you are a beneficiary of so much harm. But it's nonetheless the truth. It's in truth Indigenous people know very deeply, and that we are committed to working beyond. And so for Canadians, I think it's really important, instead of using today as just like a fluffy little holiday, something that, you know, you can feel good about putting a Every Child Matters banner on, that you actually also sit and think about, am I willing to accept that hard, ugly truth? And am I at peace with that? And am I willing to work with Indigenous people to figure out how we can go and move through that? And if you can't answer those questions, now is the perfect time to actually think about and do it.
Riley, fantastic. Thank you so much. These discussions are the tip of the iceberg, but we're going to continue them. And I so appreciate you being here in this space with us and talking about